about the ontological argument. How it works. A priori argument for God's existence holding that the concept of God implies his necessary existence. Ontology, modal logic, possible worlds, a priori argument, necessary being, and contingent being. Let's define these. Ontology is the study of being. Modal logic is a type of logic that deals with the necessity and possibility. Possible worlds is a possible way of describing reality that is logically coherent and involves a coherent concept. A priori argument is an argument that does not require sense experience. It could be made even if you had no knowledge of the external world. A necessary being is a being that cannot not be. It is impossible for it to not exist. And a contingent being is a being that could exist but doesn't need to. Saint Anselm's version is: first, our understanding of God is a being than which no greater can be conceived. The second is: the idea of God exists within the mind. Third is: a being that which exists both in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. Fourth criteria is: if God only exists in the mind, then we can conceive of a greater being, that which exists in reality. Fifth is: we cannot be imagining something greater than God. Therefore, God exists. Notice Anselm is not arguing that because we can conceive of God, this somehow proves he exists. Rather, Anselm is saying that the concept of the greatest conceivable being cannot be conceived to not exist. Guanello's objection was he criticized the argument, saying that one is forced by the logic of the argument to postulate the existence of all sorts of ridiculous beings, like that of a most perfect island, or a necessarily existent lion. The response to this is that one cannot really conceive of a greatest conceivable island, because in the case of islands, there can always be more palm trees or native dancing girls. And a necessarily existent lion cannot be conceived of because it would have to be existent in every possible world. And it does not make sense to say that a finite physical being exists in every possible world. The key objection here is these are not necessarily necessary beings because we can conceive of them as not existing, while this is not the case with the greatest conceivable being. Immanuel Kant's critique was: Kant argued that the existence is not predicate. In other words, existent is not property that a thing can either possess or lack. In other words, when people assert that God exists, they are not saying that there is a God and he possesses property of existence. If one conceives of a $100 bill, for example, existence does not add value to what is being conceived. It's worth the same regardless whether or not I have it. The response to this, however, is, although it's true, however, the property of necessary being is a perfection. It is greater to exist necessarily than to not exist necessarily. Also, it's possible to conceive of a possible necessary being. Anselm's second formulation of the argument started by definition. God is a being than which no greater can be imagined. A being that necessarily exists in reality is greater than a being that does not necessarily exist. Third, thus by definition, if God exists as an idea in the mind but does not necessarily exist in reality, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God. Thus, if God exists in the mind as an idea, then God necessarily exists in reality. God exists in the mind as an idea. Therefore, God necessarily exists in reality. Plantinga's version is: it is possible that a maximally great being exists. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. What Plantinga's argument shows is that if a maximally great being is possible, then it is necessary. The concept of a maximally great being is intuitively a coherent notion. I can conceive of it, so at least it's possible. And from that it follows, from premise 3, that a maximally great being necessarily exists.